for a few more people to join. So if you are patient, that Okay, we can get started now. Welcome everyone to the first session in our three-part webinar series, Conducting Carbon Footprint Assessments. So the title of this session is Carbon Footprint Assessments, What and Why? And we're going to be covering the basics of conducting a greenhouse gas inventory and providing some key concepts and resources to support climate action and analysis for this activity. To go over some ground rules, you should all have a little box on the right-hand corner of your screen for questions. Our presenters have agreed to take questions throughout their presentation. So if you do have a question, please use that question box, and you can direct it to the panelists or to everyone if you need to, but the panelists are going to be the ones answering those questions. And we will also have some time at the very end of the session to do some additional question and answers. Right now you are seeing a website for this webinar. Session 1 is what we're doing today. In 2 weeks we have session 2, which is the follow-up, going through step-by-step instructions of how to conduct an inventory. And then the third session is focused on case studies. So if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to sign up for session 2 and session 3. That way you'll have a more complete picture of how to conduct a carbon footprint assessment. So with that, I'm going to introduce Michelle Gaither. She is from the Pollution Prevention Resource Center. That's in Region 10, so the northwest states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska. And Michelle has been helping me to plan and organize these 3 webinars. So she's really been a good partner on that. And we've been doing it as part of the Pollution Prevention Resource Exchange, our P2RX program. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and please feel free again to use the question box if you have any issues. But hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, excuse me just a second while I get my screen up.
Okay, looks good.
Great, thank you. And you can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Personally, I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar today, and hoping that you're all having nice weather. Here in Seattle, it's a beautiful sunny day after several days of torrential rain, which have canceled all my kids' baseball games. But I'm hoping that today is the start of our spring here in Seattle. I'm excited about this webinar series, and I hope that everybody will come away with a fuller understanding of why, what, the tools, and the basics of how to account for and report greenhouse gas emissions. And as you all know, carbon footprints can be useful for informal use or internal use, or for verified reporting, using carbon offset purchases, and all the way from a household level onto a business or a project and up to an agency or community level, and even at a national level. I'm thrilled to have partnered with NUMOA and our speaker for today, Good Company, Joshua Scove with Good Company. And but before I hand the reins over to him, I want to take a few minutes to describe what the Pacific Northwest Pollution Prevention Resource Center, heretofore referred to as PPRC, what we've been trying to develop as far as assistance and resources to help out the P2RX network and anybody else who is interested in trying to get going in this area. So P2RX.org is our umbrella organization, and NUMOA and PPRC are both within here, and there's 6 other centers, each trying to assist technical assistance providers in the different EPA regions across the country. Our mission is really to assist in reducing waste and toxics, conserving resources such as energy and water, and we feel these objectives are achievable by integrating pollution prevention into the operations and administration of organizations. So just to talk a little bit about what PPRC has done, we've been using the Seattle Climate Action Partnership Calculator for the last several years to conduct our own annual carbon footprint. And while we're a small office and it's not a huge endeavor to calculate this, it is very helpful for us as a group to start motivating ourselves to reduce that on a per person, the carbon emissions per person on an annual basis. Let's see, I guess I'll move down to my next slide. Our climate change topic hub, this is a collaboration by all of the centers that I mentioned previously, and we've been working over the years to develop what we call topic hubs on various industry sector topics or issues. And as you can see, the climate change topic hub is one we produced recently, and here's the table of contents for that climate change topic hub. It's intended to be kind of a primer for anybody, but we also, in the climate change solutions section, are providing a lot of tools and resources and links to useful bits of information for people wanting to begin or conduct carbon inventories. My colleague Kathy Bowler at PPRC spent the last year gathering survey information and work group information about where are we now with what needs are there out there for our community, for businesses and institutions wanting to look at energy efficiency and climate change issues. And we are going to have a webinar on this and another probably within the next month on her findings. And I'm pulling out one table about the useful tools and resources to date, but there's another table or another pie chart along these lines saying what do people need. This is what's out there. This is what people feel is out there as tools, and but what do they need? Is this meeting their needs? And it provides a good roadmap for where we need to go and what tools we need to be developing and resources we need access to. So I've also been involved in this West Coast Climate Change Forum and Inventory Work Group, and this group is trying to deal with materials management approaches from a state and local climate protection, the community level mostly. But I urge you to take a look at this website if you're especially interested in the impacts of materials and waste and trying to put inventory on those, some of the Scope 3 emissions. Also, it would just let you know that Josh and I and Rachel will work together after this based on what we hear from you, from everybody, from the attendees, to put kind of a resource list together of things that you might be interested in. And we will also be posting this to our slides for your review afterwards. So another thing that PPRC has been doing recently, well, for the last 3 years, is working with EPA and the states and the manufacturing extension partnerships to incorporate the environmental pollution prevention aspects into the lean efforts across the country. And lean is, if you don't know, is simply a way to, well, it's not simple, but a way to bring efficiency, a number of set of tools to bring efficiency to manufacturers to improve their competitiveness and productivity. So we're trying to bring in that energy and environmental side to that. So this Lean and Energy Toolkit by the EPA is a really good tool, and they're currently in the process of updating it to make it the EPA Lean Energy and Climate Toolkit. So we're going to be helping out with that effort. And finally, we have a rapid response service, and this is something that all of the PTORX centers offer, but we are able to provide up to 5 hours of research on, oh, I'm sorry for my typo, research on various issues or questions you might have around climate change and carbon footprinting inventories. So one of what I found really interesting recently is our local King County person called and said, hey, I've got hazardous waste management issues, and I'm wanting to increase the impact of my message about reducing the use of hazardous materials. So what climate change impacts can you tie to the reduction of hazardous material use? So you can get kind of a double whammy and really make that message count and have people not only reduce hazardous and toxic material use, but also have an impact on lowering the greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the typical kind of a Dear Abby type questions that you could feel free to propose to PPRC, and we can go ahead and research that for you. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Joshua Scove, and we really appreciate Joshua and Sasha's work in helping to develop this webinar today. And Good Company has worked with carbon accounting in private and public sector, looking at goods and services, looking at alternative fuels, and as well as the direct and indirect emissions. And they have a real diversity of experience, and one of Joshua's comments is the right inventory for an organization and exactly how to carry that out and report the results is going to vary greatly from one organization to the next. So I really urge you to listen to Joshua's presentation with your organization and your client organizations, their specific circumstances and needs in mind. And I am done, and I'd like to now turn it over to Joshua. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Michelle and Rachel, for the introductions. And let's see. Let me just check and make sure that I'm visible and audible. Is that right, Rachel or Michelle?
Yes.
Or somebody?
Yep,
okay.
You are.
Okay, great. Just checking. It would be embarrassing to get deep into the webinar before discovering that I'm not. So just confirming. Welcome, everyone. It looks like we have almost 30 people on here, and the introduction by Michelle, I think, just it gives me a good leaping off point. I'm going to dive right into the content. Let me make a couple of notes along the way, and let me just thank the sponsors now. I'll say more about that later, but it's great to be doing this with NUMOA and PPRC. So very quickly, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. I say introduction, so I want to say a little bit about my firm and a little bit about myself, so you have some idea of what I do and why I'd be doing this today. I'm going to provide some background that I think is really important context for doing greenhouse gas inventories. I think sometimes these are disembodied calculations that sit outside of the context that makes them meaningful. So today is going to be a lot about that context. And then I'll give some examples of greenhouse gas inventories at different scales. And although the next session on May 12th is going to be the how-to session, and it's going to walk through the various steps of doing greenhouse gas inventory, today I want to take a little bit of time on boundaries, the boundaries that one sets for an inventory. I think that's probably the most important initial set of questions, and it relates to everything, to the capacity you have on hand, the data you have available, that overall context that you're inside of, and also the strategy implications for your organization. And then one quick upfront just logistical and format issue. Everyone is muted except for me, obviously, and then it sounds like Rachel. But please type questions into the chat window. I'm going to let a number of questions probably accumulate over time, and I'll answer them in batches, or I may put them off until later when the content is relevant. But as soon as you have a question, feel free to put it up there on in the chat window, and we'll address it at the appropriate time. Also, about 30 minutes out, and I'll sort of warn you as we get closer. I'm going to set my timer right now, but about half an hour from now, about midstream here, I'm going to pause. Some people I've found on webinars like to have a minute or two to compose questions and to look back at their notes, so we'll give you a chance to do that as well. So feel free to send questions as we go, but also we'll have a moment of silence for composing questions that may take a little bit longer, half an hour from now. So, forging ahead, quick introductions. Good Company is a sustainability research and consulting firm. We're based in Eugene, Oregon. We've been around for a little more than a decade. We are a for-profit company, but we're very much mission-driven. All of our work has to do with sustainability, and increasingly over the last few years, climate change. We've worked for over 70 organizations in 10 states, Canada, and Mexico. My background is originally as an economist. I've been a consultant long enough that that's really a big part of my background. I'm a lead AP, though, as many of you in the audience who maybe lead APs know, that just means that I took a test. But for me, it also means that a lot of our clients have big building portfolios, and that's where I've spent some of my time as a consultant. And I also do a lot of instruction of various kinds, including in some MBA programs. And the reason I flag the MBA programs is that I think, you know, as you'll hear, one of the messages I think we need to get out more is the economic opportunity in climate action. And that isn't going to be the focus today, but I will circle back to it on a number of occasions. I think it's important to remind people that this isn't all just hard work and sacrifice, but that actually there are some substantial win-win opportunities in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions and confronting climate change. So that's all I'm going to say on Good Company and myself. You see our website there. If you have other questions, obviously you're free to get in touch with me, but that's as much autobiography as you'll get today. So, diving into the background, I'm going to spend a moment on terminology. I have a couple of slides on climate science, less because I think this is new to most of the people on the webinar, and more because I want people to have to see a very short set piece that might be useful to you. And you'll have these slides afterwards if you want them. PowerPoint will be posted, but if you need the original slides for your own purposes, don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm going to do a quick overview of U.S. and global emissions, just make a few comments. Some of these science issues and technical issues drift unanswered, I've found, if I don't. And then I'm going to introduce a device that I call carbon goggles. More on that in a little bit. I'm going to want you not to have carbon goggles exclusively, not to see only greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And actually, Michelle's comments a little bit earlier call out some of these opportunities that are win-win in different ways, maybe toxics and greenhouse gas emissions reduction simultaneously. So more on that in a bit. And then I'll have a number of examples of looking at life cycle carbon emissions or life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in the inventory examples. Now, this is ultimately a pretty short webinar. There are a lot of topics we won't cover. I'm going to list a few right here that simply can't be done quickly enough and just had to be excluded. But if there are questions, we have a number of resources I can send you, and my colleague Sasha is here with me taking notes on these things, and we'll send out a number of links on these and related topics if people have questions as we go. But just really quickly, carbon markets, offsets, and renewable energy credits are going to be excluded. Sorry, apologies for the duplicate bullet point there, but just to be clear, we're not going to talk about carbon markets and markets for environmental commodities in any detail. The issue of climate risk I'll allude to, but really this is its own topic. This is really a strategic lens on the issues related to climate change for an organization. A cost of carbon, again, either as the result of a cap and trade system or a carbon tax, you know, any particular policy instrument. You know, we're not going to be talking about those issues. And then there's a lot of what I would call implicit climate policy underway that's really masquerading as energy policy. Not really masquerading, it's explicitly energy policy, but it has the impact of being implicit climate policy, and we have a great deal of that today because we lack the national consensus to act on climate explicitly. So we're not going to talk about those things, but they'll be kind of hovering around the edges of the discussion. If you have questions, we may refer you to resources on those things. So now to the topics that we actually will cover in detail. So I'm going to put up a number of terms here. I'm going to say something about them very briefly because I found if I don't, I think they linger. But if you have other terminology questions, feel free to put them in the chat window as we go. So global warming and climate change, I'm going to refer to these synonymously. I think they actually are and should be considered synonymous. Global warming might be might refer to the easiest phenomenon to measure clearly, but it's really changes in climate as a result of the rise in globally average temperatures that we worry most about. Life cycle greenhouse gas emissions or life cycle carbon, I'll speak about quite a bit, and that I will define that explicitly later on. Essentially, I mean all of the emissions associated with a good, a service, or a piece of infrastructure, or some particular identifiable thing with clear boundaries. A cost of carbon will probably surface, but again, we're not going to discuss the implications of it in detail. That just means the cost of emitting greenhouse gases as a result of regulatory mechanisms. I'll also use the terms greenhouse gas inventory, GHG inventory, carbon footprint, even climate footprint interchangeably. We should think about these things as the same. That's what I've found they're coming to be as synonymous. Climate risk, carbon risk, cost of carbon risk, these are all just the risks for an organization associated with these things. Carbon disclosure and emissions disclosure, I've found surface a lot when people talk about reporting. They really are, it just means putting information on your climate performance in the public domain. Climate action or climate action planning just means taking action on these things as, separate from just disclosing your emissions. Global warming potential, we'll say more about in a moment, referring to different greenhouse gases and their impact on warming. And then greenhouse gases, GHG emissions, GHGs, global warming pollution, CO2, CO2e, all of these things get used pretty synonymously, and they're really only shades of differences. I'm going to say carbon a lot. I want to acknowledge up front so people don't worry that I'm terribly scientifically illiterate. Carbon, of course, is inaccurate. Really, we're talking about all carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, which is CO2 and a number of other things we'll mention. But carbon is pretty common nomenclature, and so I will use that. And last, because carbon footprint has crept into our language, I want to make sure that people know that carbon footprint and ecological footprint, notice the capitalization there, refer to different things. You can answer questions on that if people have them later. So these are some of the terms I'll be using. If people have other terminology questions, which I will surely be responsible for, I bet I will accidentally use some jargon as we go, don't hesitate to ask those things in the chat window. So a quick summary of climate science, and again, this is really just a backdrop that I think we should feel free to refer to when we're discussing these things. And this has become unfortunately contentious in our society, but I think it's important to note the summary points that overwhelming consensus in the scientific community has given us. The last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, summary reports in 2007, or reports in 2007, had a few big themes. I'd summarize them this way. We have observed changes in climate. Anthropogenic or human-caused warming is singled out as the biggest deal, and future changes in climate are inevitable in the short term and all but inevitable in the longer term if we don't do something to move off our current emissions trajectory in a big way. Now, some people want a little bit more summary in the IPCC's words. I would take this statement that I put on your screen here. I think this is the best single paragraph the scientists were responsible for. Oh, excuse me. I appear to have. There we go. Let me read this to you. This is from, there were 3 big working groups in the IPCC. This is from the working group 2, which is talking about, looking ahead into the future. And it's talking about working group 1, which is the group that summarized the science to date. So let me read this to you and then parse it. The working group 1 fourth assessment, in other words, the scientists who summarized the science, concluded that most of the observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century, in other words, most of the recent temperature rise, is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Another way of saying that is it's very likely due to us. So Scientists who summarized the science found that the recent average temperature rise is very likely due to us. Now, I've noticed when presenting this that people single out that issue of very likely. They say very likely, very likely. What is very likely? Couldn't the scientists have been more precise? Well, fortunately, in the document I'm referring to here, there is a description of likelihood table, and notice that virtually certain, very likely, likely, about as likely as not, unlikely, very unlikely, and exceptionally unlikely are all defined. And this one is 90 to 99% probability, according to science. So that's really, I point out to people that this is where the scientists have ended up in very large numbers, and this is also where policymakers increasingly around the globe are ending up. That this is something that we are, beyond any reasonable doubt, and certainly beyond any doubt that we can resolve in the time frame we need to act, this is something we're responsible for, and we need to take action. So again, this is just something I offer you to use in your own context. It's probably not news to most people. So cornerstone concept: life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. What do I mean by this? Now that we've complained about the warming of the planet, let's talk about these actual emissions. I mean the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the entire life cycle of a product, service, infrastructure component, or other activity. And what do we mean, or what do we know now about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for most of what we do and what we buy, and that's as individuals or as organizations? So I offer you this language. Some of the emissions belong to us. They are owned emissions. They're direct emissions. I'll say more about this later, and I'll also say more about shared emissions, some of the emissions that belong to others. But those are others that we might be involved with. So in the life cycles that we participate in, maybe we own some emissions, maybe we share some of the others, but all of them relate to us in one way or another. And we also know that we have not had to calculate these before, for the most part. For most things that we, whether it's foods we eat or buildings we use or vehicles we drive or bike on or pieces of infrastructure we use or services that we consume, we in general have not had to calculate these things, and that means that we don't have much intuition about what is big and what is small. And I have found that this is true even for myself. I say this very humbly, that often I'm surprised about where emissions appear in the life cycle of things. So we really should approach this concept with humility because it is complex and because it is not always intuitive. And overwhelmingly, I'm going to stress that this is about boundaries. This is about making sure you take the boundaries that make the most sense. And in general, I'll just skip to the chase on this. I encourage people to think in the broadest possible boundaries, to think about entire life cycles. That doesn't mean taking exclusive responsibility for all emissions. Remember, some of those you may own and some you may feel you only share. But thinking with boundaries that are as broad as possible is often the way to get the most insight. And I'll give examples about this in a bit. So I've referred to a number of greenhouse gas emissions. I would be remiss if I didn't put up a slide with some of this information. These are the main greenhouse gases. Just very quickly on what GWP, or global warming potential, is. Everything in the greenhouse gas inventory world gets normalized to carbon dioxide equivalent, and we do that by using global warming potential of different gases. What this means is that what you see in the right-hand column is numbers that represent how much more powerful as a greenhouse gas each of those other gases is than CO2. So that means, you see methane is 21, nitrous oxide is 310. We have a whole group of other major greenhouse gases, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. Sulfur hexafluoride is used in transformers in the electric power industry and a couple of other places. Those other greenhouse gases, you can see, range from being powerful to very, very powerful compared to CO2. Still, most of our emissions, as you'll see, are CO2 by a long shot. But it's important to know that there's some underlying math for what we're doing here. And I include in the bottom row, you see there, black carbon, and that's direct emissions of elemental carbon, usually in the form of soot from dirty fuels and from some other anthropogenic processes. We can put some other things in there too. We're managing to invent other greenhouse gases and quantify them. Nitrogen trifluoride is often a favorite example, something used in the manufacture of flat screen TVs and computer monitors. These seem to be the gases that matter most, but we should expect that maybe these things will change as modern chemistry shifts as well. But these are the ones that certainly we can worry about most for now. So what is the distribution of these emissions and how much do the different ones matter? If you take a look at the U.S. GHG emissions on the right-hand side, take a look at that first, you see that the overwhelming majority of our CO2 equivalent, and again, the gases here have all been transformed into CO2 equivalents, so you don't have to do any of the multiplication that I implied in the previous table. Overwhelmingly, we're talking about CO2. And I think that's important because some of us work in or at the edges of the waste management industry, and people often talk about methane from landfills. People who are involved in agriculture or food supply chains. We'll talk about N2O. A lot of the N2O emissions are related to nitrogen fertilizers and used in ag. But these things have already been accounted for. The fact that those are more powerful greenhouse gases has been accounted for here. CO2 is still most of our challenge. That said, you know, as with much of life, individual results may vary. And depending on your business model or your industry or the technologies you use, this pie chart could look quite different. And I'll give an example or two of that a little bit later. On the left-hand side, you see world greenhouse gas emissions. Most of that is still CO2. There's a separate CO2 item called out there for biological sources that humans are responsible for, mainly through deforestation. But still, over half is related to fossil fuel use. And that's I think, an important takeaway. Now, I like to summarize this in the following way. And now I'm rounding, to be clear. And again, individual results will vary. But I would sum it up this way, that there's an important link between energy and climate, and we should be explicit about it. The climate crisis is first and foremost an energy challenge. And I'll show you a graph on that in a moment. But not exclusively, but definitely first and foremost. And right now, that energy challenge is first and foremost an efficiency opportunity. We have huge opportunities to use the fuels that we use, and just to use energy in general, whatever fuel it may come from originally, dramatically more efficiently. And we're still on the front end of realizing that opportunity. And then in the long run, efficiency aside, the energy challenge is also a transition challenge. We need to move away from our dependence on fossil fuels, efficiency aside, toward other more environmentally friendly and more sustainable sources of energy. So a few graphs to make these points. And again, these are hooks to hang stuff on in the future. We won't spend a lot of time on all of these. Now, yes, some of you are surely thinking it's cruel for me to put a diagram quite this complicated up there, and I hope it is legible on most screens. But you'll have access to the full slide at the end. And the key point of this is just to understand the complexity and the issues in our energy system. Overwhelmingly, our energy system is about what this slide calls rejected energy, which is really an unnecessarily nerdy term for lost energy, energy that we have squandered in the process of being inefficient. And when you see that most of our primary energy use ends up that way, that really should be our starting point. That climate action and climate action can consist overwhelmingly of, or not overwhelmingly, but importantly of transforming the way we use energy to become more efficient. But it's also worth noting that we have most of our energy coming from fossil fuels. And that's why the energy challenge and the climate crisis go hand in hand. Now, I'm not going to hang out on the subsequent slide, which you can see is pretty similar, but this it takes the same energy sources and breaks them down by greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to total energy use. This is just for your own use in the future. I guess the similarity between the two slides is really just to emphasize this point. Energy action and climate action are intimately related. And again, we could go through individual sources here. It's the CO2 emissions that matter most from this, and it's also we have individual sources that are big. I call out transportation because it's the single largest one, but notice how if we're going to think about dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we need to be looking across all categories of energy use and all categories of emissions. Now, this is a slide from a recent document that gets updated periodically by McKinsey & Company, the global consulting firm, called Pathways to a Low Carbon Economy. I call it out today not because we can go through this graph in detail, but because I have noticed this document becoming really encouragingly, part of the common language in corporate America and in policy circles. What this graph is called the abatement cost curve. Abatement is another term that McKinsey uses for GHG reduction. And the abatement cost curve is exactly that. It ranks different GHG reduction or GHG abatement opportunities from least cost to highest cost. And the reason I think this has become a compelling idea to people, not just a neat graph to show, but something that offers both hope and specifically hope of realizing the economic opportunity in climate action, is that the message here is itself really encouraging. If you look on the left-hand side of the graph, what you see defined by the vertical axis, the cost of reducing these tons of greenhouse gas emissions, what you see is a whole bunch of things that fall below the horizontal axis. So on the left-hand side, you have a bunch of things that, a bunch of climate action opportunities that have negative cost. In other words, cost savings. So that adds up to quite a bit. Right now, global emissions are around 40 gigatons per year. Global emissions from human activities, and you can see there that something like a third of that, right around 13 or so gigatons per year, we could reduce and actually save money. Frankly, I don't think this message has gotten out. If you think about the public discourse in the United States over climate policy in the last couple of years, it's been about how costly climate change would be. But in fact, this is not really the case. This is something where a huge amount of the short-term action could save us an awful lot of money and give us the resources to pursue more opportunities. So again, we won't walk through this in detail, but I really encourage people to take a look at pathways to a low-carbon economy, if at all possible. And you'll see a lot of detail in there that, again, is very encouraging, sector by sector throughout the U.S. economy. Now, I showed it to someone the other day, and they sent me this New Yorker cartoon. You see an important guy in front of a boardroom. And so, while the end-of-the-world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. I guess I want to be clear. I don't just mean this in terms of corporate entities making more and more money, but I mean it in the sense of everybody being able to share in increased prosperity that can come from taking on climate change. I think that that overall opportunity is dramatically undersold. So if you prefer this cynical interpretation, you're welcome to use the New Yorker slide, of course, if you purchase it. A couple of quick notes on global emissions, and then I'm going to get to boundaries before we're getting close to our time to pause here, about 7 minutes out. So I'm not going to walk through this pie chart. You will have it, but I just want you to see there are different ways to slice and dice greenhouse gas emissions at the global level or the national level. I'm going to take a little bit more time at a national level snapshot in a moment. I think what's most important about having some of these very big picture pie charts available when you're doing a greenhouse gas inventory, when you're reporting results to your organization, is to provide that context. What is often missing for people is where their emissions fit in. How big are our emissions compared to global emissions of the kinds that we have? People ask me these questions all the time. I can provide a pie chart for their organization, but people always wonder about their context. What bigger trends, what bigger aspects of climate action are we responsible for? What are we supposed to participate in? And you look at this at a high level, I think it'll be intuitive to a lot of people, a lot in industry, a lot in electric power, a lot in heating, cooling, lighting, buildings, a big slice in transportation, and of course in agriculture. And for that, again, that forestry is overwhelmingly deforestation, overwhelmingly in the developing world. But the point is, where do we fit in? As a government agency, as a nonprofit, as a corporation, and even at the household level. That's the question that people want answered, and you'll need to refer to these things to make sense of that. The other kind of question I get from people frequently is, whose emissions are big. I often hear, I think a lot of you know that China has surpassed the U.S. And as being the world's largest emitter. We've slipped into second place. But what does that mean? What is the composition of those emissions? I think often people want that sort of context. And that information is out there, and I encourage you to use it when you have a GHG inventory that you need to present the results up to people. Now, quick note on carbon goggles, and then we'll get into the question of boundaries briefly, and we will, and then we'll pause to take some questions. What do I mean by carbon goggles? Everything I've talked about up to now, with the exception of some comments on energy, really has been about greenhouse gas emissions, and that is the focus today. We're really just talking about quantifying carbon and putting that in context. But most, virtually all, greenhouse gas generating activities have other impacts. So, for example, using diesel or other petroleum-based fuels results in air pollution. Fossil fuel extraction, you may recall from recent events, can involve oil spills with all sorts of habitat impacts and human impacts. Atmospheric CO2 we're talking about today in the context of the warming impacts it has, but I think the scariest big issue associated with increased atmospheric CO2 that doesn't get talked about too much is ocean acidification. That's the dissolving of CO2 in surface waters globally in the ocean and turning into carbonic acid and lowering the pH of the ocean gradually over time. And then in all cases, cost, right? Even when we're quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, we are referring to things that we paid money for, right? If we're talking about fossil fuels, we're talking about things that we bought and have burned. And this is important because it's sufficiently complicated that it's easy to forget some of these other things. And it's also true that when we go off to deal with our greenhouse gas emissions, some of our solutions have unintended consequences that might be, in some people's view, in our own view perhaps, as big a deal as the greenhouse gas emissions consequences. So biofuels is far and away the easiest example to, maybe I'm picking on it, but I think it's just worth mentioning. And biofuels is not just one thing, right? It's many different fuel pathways. But some of them are associated with substantial habitat degradation or destruction. Some of them involve significant stress on water resources for growing biological feedstocks, for making fuels, and for processing the feedstocks. And then in the case of certain biofuels and certain feedstocks, there's a food versus fuel debate about whether using those feedstocks for biofuels actually reduces the supply of food for perhaps the world's hungriest people. So this is this is important for us to keep in mind, right? We're going to have the carbon goggles on. We want to look at greenhouse gas emissions really keenly and carefully, but we also have to take those goggles off as appropriate to the circumstances. And I encourage you to think about it this way. You can have this relentless focus, be really detailed and careful in quantifying GHG emissions, but at some point, along the way, you need to lift those goggles off your face and look at the other impacts associated with the greenhouse gas emitting activities that you're quantifying the effects of. All right, so let me introduce carbon footprints and get into inventories very briefly, and then we'll dive in, and then we'll have a short break for people to type in questions. And I'll just point out that the italicized sections here are topics that will overwhelmingly be covered in the May 12th webinar. I'm not going to go through the steps involved in doing a GHG inventory and the detailed data issues, and the reporting on climate performance will also be something we'll cover in greater detail next time. So first of all, why bother? Why bother doing carbon footprint? Well, let me give you a list of reasons. I think this is most of them in one form or another, and you may have others you want to mention, but not all these apply to every organization, and it's really about figuring out what the case is in your own. So first of all, you have to do it. Some people have to do some sort of carbon footprinting exercise. It's required in a regulatory setting. It might be essentially required because of some commitment the organization has made, but typically we're talking about regulatory commitments here. So that is definitely one reason, and some people who come to us have that in mind. Sometimes it's a big customer. You're in the supply chain of somebody who wants you to do a carbon footprint. The other reason you might do it is to understand this climate risk. Again, we'll allude to this a little bit later, but impending regulation or impending non-regulatory risk like the supply chain, you might just want to know these things from a risk management standpoint. That's certainly the case for many of my clients. Some people also want to manage a challenge that might matter a lot to certain stakeholders. So in other words, they want to be proactive about something that matters to people often outside the organization. And this is really about getting ahead of that. It's not regulatory in nature, it's proactive, but it means a lot to them. And in some cases, some organizations are simply living up to institutional commitments. Some of that is about being proactive. Some of it almost looks a little regulatory. The easiest examples on this I have are the in higher education. Some of you may know about the President's Climate Commitment, and also, of course, with municipal governments, we have the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. These are institutional commitments. They're very much beyond compliance, but they commit the organization to doing a number of things, including a greenhouse gas inventory and ultimately a climate action plan. And then last, it might also be the right thing. And I don't mean this in a grand sense. You know, there's no sort of globally applicable ethics code, but in some organizations, the organizational culture and organizational mission, especially, really require you to take a close look at these things. So 2 more slides, and then I'll break for people to type in some questions. A number of observers in the mainstream media and elsewhere have said, well, this sounds really expensive to require people to measure greenhouse gases. And Michelle shared with me this this recent article from the Bloomberg Government Insider about the cost of measuring greenhouse gases. And you can see, you know, this is a print article. They were looking across a number of different industries, from landfills to manufacturing of different kinds to, you know, the petroleum industry, saying, you know, what would be the cost of measuring greenhouse gases? You know, the labor and the capital cost to U.S. industry, you know, in a reporting year. And you know, there's a big number, 115. It has million next to it, so $115 million is not chicken scratch. But I guess what I want you to ask, I'm not going to weigh in on whether this is a lot or a little. I mean, I can say it might be a lot compared to, you know, the money that any one of us handles in a given year. It's certainly a very small amount compared to the total U.S. economy. But what I want you to ask yourself is this, from your organization standpoint or a client organization standpoint, is this just costly regulation or is it strategic self-knowledge? And obviously the people who are acting most proactively view it as strategic self-knowledge, but I think we have to make that case for people. We can't just say, hey, it's a good idea for you to know this. We want to make the case about why, and help them understand the opportunity, help them understand it doesn't have to be as burdensome as they may think, but make the case. Don't just sweep it under the rug. So I'm going to say more about boundaries, but I'm going to pause here for a minute or two. I'm just a little bit behind where I'd hoped to be. So I'll pause for a minute, and if people want to type in questions, now is your chance. We'll take about another 30 seconds and let people compose a few more questions, and then I will stack those up and either answer them now or deal with them throughout the remainder. Okay, I've got a couple of things here. There's one about the EPA's electronic greenhouse gas reporting tool. That's not something I'm going to cover, but I'll make some comments on tools this time briefly, mainly next time. The other stuff I've got, I think I'm going to push on and weave into the remainder of the session. So let me dive in on boundaries. I think this is the key thing for us to spend a little bit of time on. Oops, sorry about that. So first of all, what must the boundaries of your, I'm going to give you 3 questions to ask about setting boundaries. So the first is, what must the boundaries of a GHG inventory be? Well, must. What does that mean? Regulatory requirements are certainly at the top of that list, but also internal and external expectations. If you have internal or external stakeholders who really expect you to quantify the emissions from a particular activity and you won't be able to get away with not doing so, then you have to consider that in the must category. So that's the first question to ask, and this is obviously the lowest common denominator, or the least you can do in terms of boundaries. Second, what should your boundaries be? What does that mean? What does it really make sense for you to include in your boundaries? Well, I would argue that anything over which you have responsibility or for which you have liability, any mission critical or mission related activities, things that without which your organization can't do what it does, should be included. So that leads us down the path toward things that people don't always include, like the employee commute, perhaps, or your supply chain, and we'll say more about those in a bit. And that often makes people uneasy. I would encourage you to think in terms of control versus influence. You're not just quantifying the emissions from things over which you have complete control, but also things that you could influence to some degree. And that will expand your boundaries. And then last, what can your boundaries be? Well, what do you have data for? Or is there proprietary data that you can't get a hold of because people in your supply chain don't publish it? What is the state of scientific or academic knowledge in quantifying things? These can be genuine limitations. And the last part of that is the trade-offs in the inventory process itself. Let's say you only have a small slice of one person's time for a few months. Doing a really detailed GHG inventory might not be the only thing you want their time to be spent on. Maybe you want to focus on climate action. So that may constrain your boundaries. All of these things can widen your boundaries or narrow them, but the point is I think these are helpful questions to ask. So another way of asking these questions is through the standard GHG accounting framework. Most, perhaps all of you have seen this slide before from World Resources Institute. Scopes 1, 2, and 3, you see all the different greenhouse gases hovering in the cloud above. Scopes 1, 2, and 3 are the basic accounting framework. Scope 1 is direct emissions. Those are things essentially from the things that you own, emissions from vehicles that you own or from buildings that you own. Scopes 2 and 3 are indirect. Scope 2 is just electricity. It could be other energy imports in special circumstances, but basically for most organizations it's electricity. It has its own scope because even though it's indirect, it's say emissions generated by your electric power utility, we still count it because as a separate scope that is often required because electricity is such an important emission source and so ubiquitous. And then Scope 3 is everything else, and that means all other indirect emissions. Now, in life, categories labeled everything else often are not particularly helpful, so we'll dig inside this a little bit more. But you can see here a little bit of tension between what is required, which is typically Scopes 1 and 2 by a lot of different protocols or commitments, and how important Scope 3 might be. And we'll say more about that in a little bit. And I think the best way for us to get some intuition on these inventory, on what your boundaries could or should be, is really to look at a few inventory results. And so I'm going to walk through 4 particular cases here. The whole country, a particular metropolitan area, and then 2 organization level or entity level GHG inventories, one for municipal government and the other for a company. So diving in, let's take 2 views of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So the pie chart you see on the left is the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions for the whole U.S. economy. This is in particular from 2006, but this looks very similar for just about any year. It doesn't change very much at all from year to year right now. And this is what's called the sectors-based view in the document this comes from. It's pretty standard. We often do economic accounting and other accounting by these categories: residential, commercial, ag, industry, transportation, and electric power. And it's helpful in certain ways. It tells us that electricity is a big deal, though that's used everywhere. It tells us that transportation is a big deal, though, again, there are many forms of transportation, some for people, some for goods, some for work, some not. And then it shows you direct emissions from these other sectors. And remember, these are just direct emissions. So you look at that and you think residential looks small, and residential is the only one that a person, might have that resonate with directly. Now, there's another way to slice these same emissions, and that's what this publication calls the systems view. And the systems view looks like this. It says, well, let's look at those life cycles that we participate in. And this looks quite different. It's the same emissions now, just being sliced differently. So what seems to come out on top here is, first of all, the provision of goods and food, and then second of all, buildings. So what happened here? Well, look at the provision of goods and the provision of food. That includes a bunch of manufacturing, so that's going to be located in industry. In the case of food, it includes a lot of agriculture. It also includes some electric power used throughout manufacturing and ag. And then, of course, it includes some transportation. Now, not most transportation. Most transportation is outside of freight. But the point is, all of those things come together around some categories that might relate more to an individual consumer or an individual firm. And then you see building energy use is large on the other side. So what's going on here? The point is, the way that we actually add these emissions up and the way we give them categories can be very important to how people perceive where the emissions are. On the left-hand side, if you're an individual household, you might think, wow, I'm not responsible for much. I have some transportation, though I know there's lots of other kinds of transportation for freight and air and so on. But I also, I have just this little residential slice. But if you look at the provision of goods and food, which is where most goods and food are consumed in households, all of a sudden it looks quite different. So keep this in mind both as an example of how to slice and dice the same data to make it more compelling for people, but also this is going to tell us something about where our emissions are generally. So something like half, not quite, but almost half of our emissions are in stuff. And this is going to be an important issue a little farther down the line. The source for this is a great EPA report from a couple of years ago. The title is there, and we'll send that out in the follow-up email. Now, looking at this the same way in terms of the consumption of everything associated with people's lifestyles, Good Company worked with Portland Metro, the three-county government in Portland, Oregon, to do this greenhouse gas inventory. You see these results summarized. And this is a little bit more simplified. It has just three categories: transportation, that's local transportation; energy, that's basically in-building energy use; and then materials or stuff or goods and food. And that includes the transportation, the freight movement of those things as well. This is essentially the same as what you see at the national level, but it's customized to the local level. I guess the most important thing to take away from this is how big a deal materials are, how big a deal goods and food are. And I think we understand this at the level of the society as a whole. We've had a little bit more trouble doing this at the organizational level, and that's why I'm going to give you two additional examples there. Now, I just want to acknowledge, I don't know if everyone noticed this in the question box. The question box feature may be having some problems here, so we apologize for that. I just want to acknowledge that yeah, we'll try to get as many. We've had some questions roll in, but we'll do our best to get to as many of these as possible. Okay, so those were what are called. Sorry, on the last comment on the Portland inventory, Portland Metro inventory. This is what we would call a community inventory, and that's kind of what you saw for the U.S. as a whole, even though you don't normally consider the U.S. a community by itself, but these are community inventories. This is saying what are all the emissions associated with the people's lives in these areas. I want to look at just a couple of particular organizations to give a slightly different view of things. So this is an LGO inventory, as people in my space say, a local government operations inventory for the city of Hillsborough. This is something that Hillsborough did itself. We helped out as a firm, but they get credit for doing this. And these are the emissions not associated with all of the people who live in Hillsborough, just outside of Portland, but rather the operations of city government. So take a look at this for a moment. These categories should be pretty intuitive when you think about a public sector organization and how it operates, but notice the distribution across these categories. So scopes 1, 2, and 3 are represented here, as you saw in that earlier slide. Fleet and natural gas are the two that show up there on the left. The other two are either negligible or small. And then electricity is a very big deal. And then you see that supply chain is far and away the biggest category. Now, what does that mean, supply chain? Supply chain might sound like more of a business term to some people, but that just means all of the stuff, all of the goods and services that the organization buys. And you'll notice a suspiciously round number. It was something that we had to, that had to be estimated. It couldn't be calculated very, very precisely. But there are tools out there, and those tools told us that this was a big deal, a bigger deal than any of the other emission sources. And what I want you to take away from this is how the fact that materials, goods, food, stuff, however you want to talk about it, at the national level is echoed at the organizational level. And often we ignore these things, right? So I bet many of you have seen greenhouse gas inventories that look just at scopes 1 and 2, which is completely understandable. And we know that often we're time constrained or we don't have tools, and we go for the things over which we have the most control. But in the long haul, over the long term, we do have some control, certainly influence over our supply chain. And if that's a big deal, we might want to quantify it and have that additional context. And then the last emission source there, and I included Hillsborough because it's slightly idiosyncratic, and every organization always has something a little bit different. Hillsborough happens to be the water provider to its people as well. There's not a separate water utility, and the emissions associated with operating that water network to get potable water to everybody are those emissions you see there on the far right-hand side. And again, you look at that and you say, well, does the city government of Hillsborough have responsibility for all of those emissions? After all, the water is being consumed by the people of the city. But that's where I bring back that language of owned versus shared emissions. Do they own those emissions the way they do the fleet emissions? No, probably not. But they share them. They're responsible for the infrastructure. Other people are consuming the water, but these emissions are clearly shared across households and the city government. And we could say the exact same thing, of course, about the supply chain and the commute. These are emissions that are shared between the organization making the purchases and bringing, and hiring people and employing them, but those emissions are not totally under the control of the government. So notice how this shows a bunch of different emission sources, but also these emission sources are things that you might feel slightly differently about, and you want to understand that. So let me do a quick corporate example. Again, this is an entity level example, and this is taken straight off Apple's website. You can go there and see exactly this graphic, nothing proprietary here. But I wanted to take a look at how Apple has described its carbon footprint. First of all, it's used the term environmental footprint, which I would caution against. What they really mean is carbon, and if you dig deeper, you find they just mean greenhouse gas emissions. But notice how they have, we'll give them a free ride or a pass on that one for now and take a look at what else they do. And notice how they look at the whole life cycle. And they're clearly looking at emissions that they own, that they have direct control over. That's overwhelmingly their own facilities. But they're also looking at a lot of emissions that they share, a lot of emissions that they don't have direct control over. In fact, they really make the point by including a separate pie chart that says our facilities and then the rest of the product life cycle. And you can see that it's not even close. The full life cycle of the products that they make is really the big deal. And in fact, product use, you can see is the single biggest category. That isn't even on their watch, right? I mean, that's in consumers' hands and consumers' households, where essentially the energy responsible for those greenhouse gas emissions is getting used. Now, I always have to add a caveat. I am not employed by Apple computer. I do not, I'm not a paid representative of the company. I'm not using any free Apple equipment that I've received from them as a result of being sponsored by Apple or anything weird like that. I just put this out here as an example of a company laying out the whole life cycle for people and showing its carbon footprint in terms of the whole life cycle. We don't all have the luxury of doing it in this great of detail, but this does clearly provide a set of answers to those questions I gave you before. What should you include? Apple asked that question and said, well, looks like the whole life cycle is what we should include, and that's what they've represented here. And I encourage you to do that sort of life cycle thinking in your inventory to capture all the big things that matter. Now, this is not just Apple's idea. World Resources Institute has an updated diagram. I didn't give you this one initially because I think this is a little more confusing, but I leave this in the presentation for people who may want to look at the Scope 3 emissions in detail for themselves or on behalf of clients. This is taken from WRI's recent Scope 3 protocol work. And so if you have a need of taking a look in detail at Scope 3 emissions, this is the framework for doing it. So this slide just serves as a reminder for that. Now, a couple of notes on inventory protocols because I've called this out, and then I think we're pretty close to pausing and starting just open Q&A and discussion with Michelle and Rachel. So first of all, protocols. I still often get this question about what protocol should I use, as if it's a big mystery, and I don't actually think there's much difference among the protocols now. I've bolded the climate registry because I think the climate registry's general reporting protocol is the most common one I see being used. It's not particularly different these days from the standard protocol offered by World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which I list first because that one came first. But all of these frameworks have tacked toward a fairly common platform of those three scopes. Unfortunately, as you can see, those three scopes don't answer all of the questions you'll want to have answered as you draw boundaries. And so they're really just they're guides as process documents, but they don't guide the creation of your final outputs, and they don't tell you how to talk to people in your organizations about your results. And that might matter more. The California Climate Action Registry, which has now become a couple of years ago became the Climate Action Reserve, has a whole range of protocols as well. Some of those are actually much more specific. And speaking of specific protocols, once you get more detailed in a protocol, you're really starting to talk about things that are tools. There are individual WRI protocols. They get called protocols, but to me, they look more like tools for very specific contexts, often for, say, at the project level. If you're developing an electric power generating facility or you're looking in detail at the supply chain, those protocols look more like tools. And then these other ones you see listed here are instances of either downloadable tools or websites that provide a range of tools. And I didn't make the change, but I thought as just before this session when I was listening to Michelle talk, I really should include on here EPA's WARM model, which is used for quantifying waste flows, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with waste flows under certain circumstances. And we'll send that out in a follow-up email as well. But the point is there are a lot of different tools out there for different contexts. Make sure you're using, dig around and ask people questions if you have very specific needs. But there's a lot out there now. I'll say a little bit more about this in the May 12th webinar when we'll focus more on the how-to of greenhouse gas inventories. And I'll just do another very quick note. The Seattle Climate Partnership Calculator that I list here is the one that that Michelle mentioned using at the level of PPRC's individual inventory. So let's see. I'm going to just in the interest of time, I'm just going to go very quickly through some of this the mandatory reporting and other things going on right now because I want to leave ample time for questions. So there's a lot of mandatory reporting being required at the state level in the U.S. I call out Washington, Oregon, and California because those are three of the states that have moved the fastest, and also the ones that I know best because I'm located on the West Coast. But these are by no means the only states that are doing work in this area and that are requiring entities of different kinds to report greenhouse gases. Also, EPA has some mandatory reporting as well, mainly for very large entities, 25,000 metric tons of of direct emissions, of Scope 1 emissions. That's really mainly just certain industrial and electric power generators. I guess the one thing I'd want you to take away from this is that final bullet point. In general, this is really about regulatory process, and I don't say that pejoratively, but I mean that it's a requirement to report overwhelmingly Scope 1 emissions. It's not really informing the life cycle. There's no requirement that this be integrated into corporate or entity-level strategy. So that work is still left to us to figure out not just what emissions do we have to report, what emissions must we report, but rather what should we report, what can we report, what does this mean to our individual organizations. I'm going to talk about this slide, again, in the interest of time. Next time, I'm going to point out where things are going with that, with reporting in general. But I will say just a couple of quick comments on what I think the likely directions are for reporting. I think we're going to continue having mandatory reporting at different levels. I don't see any of that going away. Of course not. That's not going to disappear. But it's important that that mandatory reporting is probably not going to be a very good strategy guide for the foreseeable future. That those deeper questions are going to be left up to us. And I think also one of the not so much talked about, but I think neat side effects of mandatory reporting will be that regulators and regulated entities will both learn something from it. I mean, I think knowledge will go quickly as people have to report their emissions, and the implications of looking at life cycle emissions will dawn on people. So just really quickly, let me thank the sponsors again, and just plug the next two webinars that are happening on May 12th and June 2nd, and then I'll pause here or end here and thank everybody and open it back up to questions. I will ask just a couple of quick questions, or I'll answer just a couple of quick questions that have dribbled in, and I just want to touch on these briefly. So two quickly. One person wrote in about the McKinsey low carbon pathways to a low carbon economy graph that I showed, and asked about net energy. So does that report take into consideration net energy? In other words, it takes a lot of energy to make photovoltaic panels, like solar PV. Is this considered? That report is very much based on cost. It's not based on net energy. Over time, I think these things converge a little bit, but not entirely. The way in which they address some of these energy issues is that they look at different scenarios for the cost of energy, and so you get to see how sensitive some of the life cycle costs are to changes in the price of energy. And we'll send out some material on that in the follow-up email. McKinsey has been pretty good about updating things and putting them in the public domain. And actually, I'll pause there, and I'll see if we can field other questions, and I'll open it back up to Rachel and/or Michelle.
Josh, we did get a couple more questions in.
Great.
I don't know if you can see them in the chat box, but if you can't, I'll just read them.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. One of the questions is, since climate change seems like an externality that we all share, how best to make the case for shouldering first costs that might help for the building owner or homeowner? All share in benefits, but one company might bear more economic costs.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a big one. I would be fooling you if I had a comprehensive answer. I mean, I think that I'll just give two quick thoughts. I think, first of all, we have to, especially in an age where where federal and state governments are really under attack we have to help people understand why there might be subsidies for renewable energy. And so I have noticed that a lot of, I think everyone's probably noticed that there are a lot of different subsidies that are on the chopping block at the level of the federal budget. But some of the subsidies for renewable energy are actually about exactly what that question is discussing, right? About the fact that this is something, climate change is a series of externalities that we are all on the hook for collectively to deal with. So I think we need to, at a policy level, I think we need to remind people that subsidies for renewable energy, things that various policies that favor renewable energy, are ways to address failures in the marketplace. The marketplace won't naturally take into account these issues. So that's at a policy level. I think that's important. Where at the level of the individual household or firm that has to make some of these investments, well, that's why we need these policy frameworks, right? You can't expect all households and businesses to make some of these, frankly, more expensive upfront decisions. Again, maybe not expensive in life cycle terms, but certainly expensive when they are big first costs. And that's why we need the right policies to incentivize those things. And then I guess a final comment on implementation. I think I often find that businesses don't realize how much help there is for transforming the energy they generate or the energy they use. So, we still have work to do, and we'll, for the foreseeable future, continue to have work to do in connecting people with the various incentives and tax credits and other things.
Great. Another question that we have says, the cost of an LCA is very dependent on the system boundaries. Could you give a range of these costs?
Yes, as you can imagine, it's inevitable that this question comes up. I usually say an LCA costs between $1 and $1 million. And that sounds like a ridiculous joke, but I think it's actually not that far off. Let me just give 3 quick comments in helping people decide how much money their organization should spend either doing greenhouse gas inventory or an LCA, or just how much total cost, total effort should be put in. First, be diligent about mining the public domain, especially if you're doing an LCA. I mean, specifically something that's not just a greenhouse gas inventory that might not have full life cycle thinking. If you're doing an LCA that involves more than just greenhouse gases, there's a remarkable amount of academic and technical literature out there on these topics, and often you can find, not something that is exactly what you want, but something that's close that you can point to and say, hey, look, someone studied X, and we're actually a lot like X, or our products are a lot like X. We should learn from that example. Take that example, take the details of the study, and say, oh, what is similar, what is different, in our circumstances. I know that we all use Google, but I think people don't use the technical literatures out there quite enough. I think there's a real opportunity to do more of that. Second, I have presented a couple of examples that were, that are attractive and very, very detailed and, frankly, very expensive, right? I mean, I don't expect you to generate a gorgeous web presence that presents all the details of your greenhouse gas inventory like Apple. Ask you to look deeply at the whole life cycles of all goods and services, as in that the EPA systems and sectors document that I mentioned. But the point of those things is not to say, hey, do we do all of that? The point of those examples is to say, what can we learn? What is, what intuition can we get? And then say, based on that intuition, where should we really put our time? And some organizations might find that actually their supply chain might not be that big, and it might be really, really difficult to do something about, and they should focus on their fleets. Or maybe an organization will find out that its employee commute is a very big deal, and what it needs to do is work with its employees to figure out how that can be transformed over time. Or it might find that building energy use actually looms very, very large. But I think especially when you are scoping an inventory, and then again when you move from your inventory results to climate action, those should be organization-specific moments of prioritization. And you shouldn't feel that because someone else studied something in detail and looked in depth in a life cycle sense that you have to do exactly the same thing. Other questions?
There's a question from Michelle in the chat box.
Oh, and I don't know if Michelle's unmuted, but the one about differentiating between project accounting and entity level accounting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Michelle asked for a quick rundown of when project level emissions inventories get done as opposed to entities. The project level inventories that I'm most familiar with have to do with things like buildings or other pieces of infrastructure. So when an organization is building a large new building, you wouldn't do this at the level of a single home, but you're building, a $100 million building or a $200 million building, as government and corporations and higher education institutions occasionally do. Or if you're building something similarly large, like a bridge or a freeway or a light rail system, at that level, the decision making and in some ways the supply chain are all specific to that project. And in that case, it might be reasonable to say not just what is the entity, what is the municipal government that will own it, or what is the college campus that will have the building, but rather what is this project, and defining boundaries at the project level. And actually, just for example, there was that previous question about the energy intensity of making solar photovoltaic panels. So you can look at that, and in fact, my firm has done that kind of life cycle energy and carbon accounting for photovoltaic panels for a utility scale installation, and we defined both energy payback and carbon payback. In other words, how quickly do those things end up, paying back? I would say avoiding the greenhouse gas emissions that were necessary to build them in the first place. And for big organizations, that kind of project level accounting might be a very important thing to do. And by the way, the carbon payback for the photovoltaic panels we looked at was about 7 years. And again, individual results may vary. It depends what the surrounding grid is like. But if you're in a part of the country that has a lot of gas and coal on the grid, as much of the country does, almost half of our electricity nationally comes from coal, and about 30% in the Pacific Northwest, that carbon payback might be a little higher. Might be a little bit faster, rather. So those are the quick comments I would make about project level emissions. It's when it's a big, discrete investment that it makes sense to look at the project level. Other questions that have come in?
I don't see any more questions that have come in. We have a few more minutes if people want to enter a question in the chat box. In the meantime, Josh, I'm just going to take the control from you and show everybody where they can get access to the presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you that are online, you should see NMOA's website and the Session 1, Carbon Footprint Assessments, What and Why. So this is the web page that we will be posting the presentations on, and we have also recorded this session, so we'll be posting the recording of this session on this page as well. If you're having a hard time writing down the URL, don't worry, you'll get a follow-up email from GoToMeeting, and this will have the URL on there. So you should be able to easily access all of these materials. And then again, don't forget, if you're interested in the other two sessions, don't forget to register for Session 2 or Session 3 of this webinar series. So, no
Rachel,
other
can I make?
yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Yeah, just a very quick comment. As I mentioned a couple of times along the way, we'll also, we'll give to NUMOA and PPRC some links and resources that relate to some of the questions that were asked. So we'll either have that on this website or have it in a follow-up email at your discretion.
Oh, thank you, Josh. That's great. Thanks for reminding me about that. So I don't see any other questions that have come in. So I just want to thank everybody for attending this session. We all hope that you gained a lot and you learned a lot from this session. I want to thank Michelle Gaither for helping me to put this on and sponsor the event. And I want to thank especially Josh Gove for conducting this presentation. It was a big effort to put everything together, but I think it came out well. So thank you for your effort.
Great. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, and so with that, I'm going to end the session, and I hope everybody has a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.